My name is Adrian Cross, and I am a man who was legally erased while still breathing. That is not a metaphor. It is not bitterness speaking. It is the technical truth. There was a period of my life when I existed only as a problem to be managed, a name to be removed from documents, a liability to be rewritten out of history. And the people who did it were the same people who once called me family. I grew up believing loyalty was earned through competence. My father taught me that. He worked maintenance at a manufacturing plant his entire life and never once complained. He said if you built something that mattered, the world would eventually notice. I believed him. I structured my entire life around that belief. By 32, I was the chief systems strategist at a logistics analytics firm called Northline Dynamics. On paper, I was an executive. In practice, I was invisible. That invisibility was not accidental. It was cultivated. Northline's success was built on predictive routing algorithms I designed over 7 years. Systems that anticipated supply chain failures days before they happened. Models that quietly saved corporations hundreds of millions while executives smiled in interviews and spoke about innovation. The public face of Northline was my co-founder, Marcus Hale. Marcus was magnetic. He had the kind of confidence that made people trust him before he said a word. He understood perception the way I understood systems. When we met, we admired each other's strengths. When we succeeded, we divided responsibilities naturally. He spoke. I built. For a long time, that balance worked. Until it didn't. The shift began after Northline landed a government contract large enough to change our valuation overnight. New advisors arrived. New lawyers. New language. Suddenly, everything was about scalability and optics. Marcus began talking about simplifying the leadership structure. About presenting a unified vision. He assured me it was cosmetic. I didn't notice the first revision of my role title. Or the second. I didn't notice when my name appeared less frequently in documentation. I was too busy fixing problems no one else could see. The first real warning came when I discovered a flaw in one of our optimization models. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but it would be. Under certain geopolitical disruptions, the system would reroute critical supplies in ways that looked efficient on paper but would collapse real-world distribution. I wrote a report. I flagged it as urgent. Marcus told me to sit on it. We'll address it after renewal, he said. Right now, we can't afford uncertainty. That was the first time I realized we were no longer aligned. I refused to drop it. I began documenting everything. Meetings, emails, internal objections. Marcus grew distant. Conversations became shorter. Decisions were made without me. Then came the restructuring. Marcus told me it was standard, necessary, investor-driven. He said everyone was signing the same agreements. He said my position was secure. I signed. 3 weeks later, my access was restricted. 2 days after that, it was revoked. HR told me my role had been absorbed into a newly formed strategic committee. I wasn't on it. By the end of the quarter, I was gone. Northline's IPO followed shortly after. Marcus stood on stage ringing the bell, hailed as a visionary who had built a revolutionary logistics intelligence platform from the ground up. My work powered every claim he made. I consulted attorneys. They were sympathetic and useless. The agreements I signed were surgical. Every line engineered to strip ownership, authorship, and future claims. Legally, Marcus owned everything. I was erased efficiently. For a few weeks, I spiraled. Not loudly, quietly. I woke up every morning with nowhere to go and too much knowledge to forget. But anger, when it settled, turned into something else. Precision. I had never trusted memory. My systems were always documented, time-stamped, and redundantly stored. Every model I built carried signature patterns only I used. Every decision Marcus overruled was recorded somewhere. I didn't plan revenge immediately. I planned survival. I disappeared from the industry. Took contract work under shell companies. Studied corporate law the way I once studied algorithms. Learned how theft hides behind governance. Learned how truth is dismissed when it arrives too early and believed when it arrives too late. I watched Northline grow. I watched my systems expand into global infrastructure. I watched Marcus testify before committees, explaining logic he didn't understand. I watched the flaw I warned about get buried under layers of optimistic reporting. Then it happened. A real-world disruption exposed the weakness exactly as I predicted. Supplies misrouted. Contracts breached. Quiet settlements paid. Northline buried it. That was when I stopped waiting. I didn't file a lawsuit. I started buying. Through proxies and intermediaries, I acquired stakes in companies dependent on Northline's technology. I mapped contractual dependencies. I traced liability chains. I built a structural map of everything that would break if the truth surfaced. When I finally acted, it was not dramatic. It was irreversible. For a long time after I left Northline Dynamics, I lived like someone hiding from a disaster that had already happened. I kept my head down, my footprint small, my expectations lower than they had ever been. I didn't talk about Marcus Hale. I didn't talk about Northline. I didn't talk about the years I had poured into building something that now pretended I had never existed. But silence is not the same as forgetting. Every system I had ever designed taught me the same lesson. Suppressed errors do not disappear. They compound, quietly, invisibly, until they surface all at once. I knew Northline's system better than anyone alive, including the people currently running it. I knew where the shortcuts were. I knew which assumptions were safe and which ones were fragile. And I knew exactly how close the company already was to a failure no amount of public relations could contain. Marcus didn't. That was the difference. I took work under shell companies, consulting on small projects that barely paid, but gave me something more valuable than money. Perspective. I watched how other companies treated risk. I saw how often executives confused dashboards with reality. And I learned how deeply dependent entire industries had become on black box systems they didn't understand. Northline was everywhere. Logistics firms, defense contractors, pharmaceutical distributors. If goods moved efficiently, Northline's models were probably involved. And buried inside those models was the flaw I had warned Marcus about. The first time it caused real damage, it was written off as a fluke. A regional disruption. A supply issue blamed on external instability. Quiet settlements were paid. Non-disclosure agreements signed. No headlines. The second time, it was harder to ignore. A multinational client suffered cascading failures across 3 continents after Northline's system rerouted shipments in a way that looked optimal mathematically, but collapsed under real-world constraints. Warehouses overflowed. Critical materials arrived late. Millions were lost. Internally, the alarms were deafening. Externally, Marcus smiled. He reassured investors. He blamed unpredictable global conditions. He announced a minor system update and moved on. That was when I stopped watching and started positioning. I didn't confront Northline. I didn't contact regulators. Not yet. Instead, I began acquiring influence where no one would think to look. Through intermediaries, I bought small but strategic stakes in companies whose operations relied heavily on Northline's technology. I studied contracts. I mapped liability clauses. I traced how risk flowed through the ecosystem. It was slow work. Unexciting. Methodical. Perfect. I learned which clients had exit clauses triggered by compliance failures. I learned which insurers underwrote Northline-dependent operations. I learned how one failure in the right place could trigger mandatory disclosures across an entire sector. I also learned something unexpected. Marcus was no longer fully in control. Northline's growth had attracted people who saw him the same way he once saw me. Useful, but replaceable. New board members. New advisors. People who spoke in calm voices and made decisions quietly. Marcus thought he was still the architect. He was already becoming the figurehead. That made him dangerous. When I finally resurfaced, it wasn't with accusations. It was with questions. I submitted a formal technical inquiry to a regulatory body under my real name. Not a complaint. Not an allegation. A request for clarification about how certain optimization systems handled cascading disruptions. The inquiry triggered a routine audit. Routine audits become dangerous when systems are built on silence. Northline responded with confidence. They provided documentation. They offered walkthroughs. They reassured regulators that their models were robust and adaptive. They were lying. Not directly. Indirect lies are safer. They provided summaries instead of raw data. High-level explanations instead of operational logs. The kind of responses that satisfy people who don't know what to ask next. Unfortunately for them, I did. I followed up. Again and again. Each question forced them to reveal a little more. Each response contradicted the last. Small inconsistencies. Minor gaps. Nothing dramatic on its own. But systems fail at the seams. Behind the scenes, clients started asking questions too. Not because they suspected wrongdoing, but because their insurers did. Risk models updated. Premiums increased. Someone noticed patterns they didn't like. Marcus called an emergency board meeting. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. I knew exactly how it would go. He would minimize. He would reassure. He would frame concerns as technical noise amplified by overcautious regulators. And he would be believed. At first, the turning point didn't come from regulators or lawsuits. It came from a mid-level operations manager at one of Northline's largest clients. She noticed that her team was manually overriding system recommendations more and more often. The model kept suggesting routes that looked efficient but failed in practice. She escalated internally. Her concerns were dismissed. So she documented everything. She sent the records to her legal department. Her legal department contacted Northline. Northline responded with a carefully worded explanation that blamed external volatility and assured future improvements. That explanation contradicted statements Marcus had made to investors 2 weeks earlier. Someone noticed. What followed was not a scandal. It was something far worse. Doubt. Analysts revised projections. Insurers reassessed exposure. Partners began quietly renegotiating terms. Northline's valuation didn't crash. It softened. Slowly. Invisibly. Like a structure losing internal support. Marcus felt it before he understood it. He reached out to me for the first time in years. Adrian, he said, his voice familiar and strained. We need to talk. I agreed. We met in a neutral space. Glass walls. Neutral colors. The kind of place designed to make difficult conversations feel controlled. He didn't apologize. He said we both knew the company was under pressure. He said my recent inquiries were unnecessary. He said we could resolve things privately. I asked him a simple question. Did you ever fix the flaw I warned you about? He avoided my eyes. We optimized around it, he said. I nodded. Optimization isn't correction, I said. He sighed. You're overreacting. This is manageable. It wasn't. I didn't threaten him. I didn't reveal my position. I simply told him the truth. The system will fail in a way you can't spin, I said. And when it does, everyone who relied on your assurances will look for someone to blame. He leaned back. You think you're untouchable now? No, I said. I think I'm prepared. That was the moment I knew he still didn't understand. The real damage came weeks later. A geopolitical disruption triggered exactly the scenario I had modeled years earlier. Northline's system rerouted critical supplies in a way that optimized cost and speed but ignored infrastructure constraints. Ports backed up. Manufacturing stalled. Governments intervened. This time, the losses were public. Regulators froze certain operations pending investigation. Clients invoked exit clauses. Insurers refused coverage. Northline's board suspended Marcus pending review. He didn't call me again. The investigations expanded quickly. Internal emails surfaced. Decision logs were examined. My original reports reappeared, time-stamped and unambiguous. I testified quietly, precisely, without emotion. When Marcus was removed permanently, there was no announcement. No drama. Just a revised organizational chart and a careful press statement about leadership changes. Northline survived. Barely. Marcus did not. And that still wasn't the end. Because what Marcus had buried was not just a flaw. It was a precedent. And now that it had been exposed once, others began looking for similar designs elsewhere. The industry shifted. Companies that once dismissed caution began asking different questions. Regulators tightened standards. Executives learned that complexity no longer guaranteed cover. I didn't destroy Marcus Hale. I revealed him. And when systems finally saw him clearly, they corrected themselves. I thought that would be enough. I was wrong. I believed Marcus Hale would be the final chapter. For years, I had imagined the story ending with his removal, his reputation dissolving quietly while the system corrected itself. When it finally happened, when his name vanished from leadership pages and his voice disappeared from earnings calls, I expected relief. Instead, I felt exposed. Not vulnerable. Exposed. Because Marcus was never the most dangerous person in the room. He was simply the one standing closest to the light. Once he was gone, the structure beneath him became visible. Northline dynamics stabilized just enough to survive. New leadership promised reform. New messaging emphasized transparency and accountability. Internally, teams were instructed to review models, reassess assumptions, and rebuild trust with clients. But no one touched the core. They couldn't. The flaw I had warned about wasn't a line of code. It was a philosophy. An optimization culture that treated uncertainty as something to be averaged away instead of confronted. That philosophy predated Marcus, and it would outlast him if left intact. That was when the real danger surfaced. A former Northline engineer contacted me quietly. We had never worked directly together, but he recognized my work. He said something had been bothering him since the investigations began. He had been asked to replicate parts of Northline's system for a new venture. Different branding, different investors, same logic. The venture wasn't small. It was being positioned as a global infrastructure platform designed to integrate logistics, energy distribution, and emergency response systems into a unified predictive framework. Governments were interested. I reviewed what he sent me. My stomach dropped. They hadn't just reused the flawed logic. They had refined it. The new system was even more efficient, even more opaque, and even harder to audit. It could reroute entire supply networks under the guise of optimization while burying accountability beneath layers of abstraction. And the investors funding it were familiar. They were the same people who had quietly pressured Northline's board during the crisis. The same people who had positioned Marcus as expendable once he became inconvenient. Marcus hadn't been punished. He had been replaced. The new venture invited me to join as a consultant. They framed it as reconciliation, as an opportunity to shape the future responsibly. They said they respected my experience. They said my concerns had been validated. They said all the right things. I declined, politely. That refusal triggered something subtle but unmistakable. Access I didn't know I had was revoked. Conversations went silent. Doors closed that I hadn't realized were open. I had been evaluated and found uncooperative. I knew then that what I had uncovered at Northline was only one layer of a larger system. A system that thrived on complexity, dispersion, and plausible deniability. A system that didn't care about individual actors as long as outcomes remained profitable. I could walk away again. I was financially secure. My name had been cleared. My work had found new purpose. I had every justification to stop. But systems don't change because one person steps aside. They change when patterns are exposed. So I did something different. I stopped acting alone. I began building alliances. Not publicly, quietly. I reached out to people who had raised concerns in other industries and been ignored. Engineers who had resigned instead of complying. Analysts whose reports had been softened beyond recognition. Regulators who had left agencies out of frustration. We didn't form an organization. We formed a network. Information moved laterally. An anomaly here. A pattern there. Nothing explosive on its own. But when combined, the picture was unmistakable. The same optimization philosophy was spreading everywhere. Energy grids, transportation systems, disaster response platforms. Systems designed to appear efficient while quietly transferring risk downward, outward, and eventually onto the public. The new venture was not unique. It was simply the most ambitious. We documented everything. Not to leak. Not to accuse. To prove. We mapped ownership structures. We traced advisory overlaps. We followed funding flows through shell entities and offshore vehicles. We identified the same legal firms, the same consultants, the same frameworks appearing again and again. The people behind these systems weren't villains in the traditional sense. They didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as optimizers. That made them dangerous. When we finally acted, it wasn't with lawsuits or press conferences. It was with inevitability. We delivered our findings simultaneously to oversight bodies across multiple jurisdictions, energy regulators, transportation authorities, defense oversight committees. Each received the same documentation, the same models, the same risk projections. No one could claim it was isolated. No one could delay without explanation. The reaction wasn't explosive. It was procedural. Reviews were initiated. Deployments paused. Contracts renegotiated. Requirements rewritten. The venture stalled. Its investors grew nervous. Timelines slipped. Governments hesitated. Then came the final twist. One of the venture's senior architects stepped forward. He admitted that the system's opacity wasn't accidental. It had been designed that way to ensure decisions could not be easily traced back to individuals. Responsibility would always be distributed, diluted, and denied. His testimony changed everything. The narrative shifted from innovation to recklessness, from ambition to negligence. The venture collapsed before it ever fully launched. No headlines celebrated the collapse. No villains were paraded. The system simply failed to materialize. That was the most important victory, because the absence of a system can be as powerful as the removal of one. I still teach. I still consult. But my focus has changed. I no longer ask how to build the most efficient system. I ask who bears the cost when it fails. Marcus Hale faded into obscurity after his removal. Occasionally, I hear his name mentioned in discussions about leadership caution. He was never charged with a crime. He didn't need to be. His punishment was irrelevance. I don't consider what I did revenge anymore. Revenge implies emotion. What I did was correction. I corrected a record. I corrected a system. And in doing so, I learned something that took me years to understand. The most dangerous people are not the ones who steal credit. They are the ones who design systems where theft is invisible. And the only way to defeat those systems is not to destroy them loudly, but to make them impossible to build again. My name is Adrian Cross. I was erased once. I won't be again, and neither will the truth.